Hello, family, friends, and future ancestors. Frank Spencer, principal at the Future School, also known as TFS. And today I'm thinking about measuring foresight. How do we do that? Is it possible? I mean, it seems like it would be very important, right? Because if we don't measure our foresight in some way, then how will the organizations and the companies and institutions and the governments, et cetera, that are trying to use foresight find any relevance out of it? Because they want to measure it. They want to be able to see it put into action. Hey, fair enough. Except I want to tell you a little story that happened to me just a couple of months ago. I was with my partners at the firm and the rest of our team at TFS working for one of the largest transportation providers in the United States, who also benchmarks outside the United States in places like Europe and Asia. And when they first brought us in to do foresight work for them, to work with their ELT, their strategic leaders, their executives, to go through foresight processes, strategic transformations, strategic initiatives, and then have outcomes, they said to us clearly from the beginning and multiple times, we want you to be provocative. We want you to seek out provocative, transformative ideas. We want to build the next 50 years of Company X. And Company X, of course, has a lot of connections to government entities and, of course, social entities and embedded in communities and innovation, et cetera, et cetera. So they're looking for big ideas, not ideas that we would just come up with, but they wanted to use real foresight. They wanted to look at scenarios of the future. They wanted to look at mapping the future, alternative possibilities. Hey, I can do that for you. And so we did over about 4 or 5 months. And everything was going splendidly. And I would say it still ended pretty splendidly. But it was interesting at one of the last meetings that we held with them, one of the executives who had been on the early call saying, be as provocative and transformative as you possibly can be, we presented to them a map, a pathway, a guidance, even strategy to be able to see how to reach these transformative futures. And still, he raised his hand and said, but how will we possibly measure the return on investment of these ideas? How do we measure foresight? Especially when foresight changes the rules of the game. What do I mean by that? Well, one of my favorite futurists, Ilka Tuomi, says that as futurists today, we certainly can look at what he calls epistemological uncertainty. And this is the idea that if I just had more data, if I just had more measurement, if I just had more information, I could make sense of the world. And that's what a lot of times futurists do. More trends, more ideas, more issues. I'm going to tell you how this is going to unfold. I'm going to give you forecasts of it. I'm going to extrapolate into the future. We'll be able to measure whether this is useful for your company, organization, government, etc. But he says, in a world of increasing volatility and uncertainty and complexity, ambiguity and brittleness and transformation and all of those acronyms that we have that I talked about on an earlier video, we have to look at futures thinking as ontological unpredictability, not just epistemic uncertainty. Ontological unpredictability is different because that means that the nature of the future is changing. So the rules are changing. The boxes are breaking open and changing. The systems want to change. They want to emerge differently. And we fight and we put up walls and barriers against those. And a lot of those walls and barriers are the way we measure. So I just got finished today seeing someone at a conference saying we're entering a new era of foresight, an era where we can measure more accurately. But I would ask this question, by what measurements and metrics? Because if we try to measure a changing nature of reality by the old metrics, we're going to be in worse trouble than if we had never looked at alternative futures in the first place. So what I'm suggesting is that we need new metrics. We have to see the world by different lenses, different measurements. Before I leave you tonight, I want to read a really great quote that I just saw just an hour or so ago from futurist Arathi Krishnan, who is the senior advisor on strategic foresight at the UNDP in Asia in particular. And here's what she said today at a conference in Berlin. She shared this: to truly flourish, We cannot design futures that merely replicate or reinforce existing and past inequalities. We must address why and how those inequalities exist in the first place. Hope is a radical act. It is what makes us cross seas and skies and take risks and jump without safety nets when the journey and arrival might endanger safety and might even diminish us. We're propelled forward by the hope for a better future for our children, our grandchildren. By hope itself, it is not enough. We must translate this hope into action that befits the types of resets we need in the redesign of new commons, new values, new wisdoms. Unsettling the coloniality of our systems is an act of resistance to the shackles that have held humanity back from evolving our potential of how we live with each other and with the planet. An act of resistance to the continued practice of designing for privilege rather than for equity and justice. Listen, we live in a time when organizations and companies and governments and institutions are going to have to face that their existence and what they do cannot be shackled by past systems of measurements and metrics and data. Those measurements, metrics, and data are based on a certain worldview. We would measure things differently if we saw the world differently, and that's exactly what Futures asks us to do, to see multiple possible alternative futures that are going to look radically different. They're not epistemic uncertainty, they're ontological unpredictability. The nature of the future is changing.